corruption was one of the main reason for the collapse of our security forces.
But it was crystal clear the Taliban didn't want peace, they wanted power, all of it.
Tim, I mean, it's a heartbreaking situation in my country. Only people who actually undergo that situation will understand the pain.
With Afghanistan under strict Taliban rule, few people have more to lose than the nation's women. My guest this week is Fawzia Koofi, a former MP who helped many women secure rights to education and work in the public sphere. She joins me now from Geneva. Why did she leave, and who, if anyone, will continue her campaign? Fawzia Koofi, welcome to Conflict Zone. As late as August the 12th, you were saying you would continue to stay in Afghanistan as long as you could. You said, I just feel that my being in Kabul will help keep the morale high. A lot of women like me are in Afghanistan, my sisters who shared their good times with me. I should actually be with them in these bad times. 18 days later, you were gone. What changed your mind? Why the sudden change of heart?
Well, first of all, I really hope that I go back. My departure from Afghanistan is not for a permanent settlement outside Afghanistan. It was just the environment in which I was, especially the fact that I was under house arrest and I couldn't do much to be more productive in terms of, empowering the woman that I was talking about then. So therefore, that security situation, as well as my own personal situation that resulted me being nowhere and nobody, made me to decide to leave. It was not an easy decision emotionally, with a hope that I will return soon, hopefully, to my country.
If you do go back and people ask you why you left them in the darkest of days, what will you say?
Well, I hope the darkest days finish soon, but from what I see happening in Afghanistan, the darkest days are still ahead of us. So we are together in this dark, long days of battle.
But if people say, you left us when we wanted you there, and you would have kept our morale high, what will you say?
I think I try to do what is possible for me to do outside. I have been meeting a lot of politicians and decision makers to inform them about the situation of women on the ground and men in Afghanistan. That way I feel more productive and more making an impact as comparing to being under house arrest, not being able to do much except join them in the streets to protest. What I do, I think, now makes, from my perspective, enormous impact in terms of telling the actual situation and story of struggle and resilience of women, but yet the hardship that they face moving forward ahead of them, especially when it comes to the fact that they have been abandoned from going to school and to work, and they are under extremely difficult security situation as well as economic oppression.
You blame the Americans for causing chaos in your country, announcing a pullout before there was any political deal between the Afghan government and the Taliban. But there was never going to be any deal on power sharing, was there? So how many more years would you have wanted the US to stay?
Nobody wants a foreign force to be in their country forever. We are a nation that fought for our freedom throughout the history. However, I think the way the withdrawal was managed and resulted the collapse of everything that we have built in the past 20 years could have been avoided. And I still think that if there was more time for a political settlement, instead of investing on withdrawal, if more leverage was used on a political settlement, including a regional consensus, pressurizing those who are actually friends of Taliban, the result would have been different.
But did you ever seriously...
There was already some talks that there will be a power sharing.
Did you ever seriously believe the Taliban would share power with you? I mean, the fact is they knew the Americans were leaving. The US had essentially stopped fighting in 2014. All they had to do was to wait for the final withdrawal, and then they'd take the whole country. Wasn't that obvious?
It was very obvious when they started when the Americans started negotiating with Taliban's on a bilateral basis without including the representative of Afghan state or the republic and the institutions. I'm not saying the government, because the government was just the executive. I mean, broader representation of Afghan state. If they only included those in the bilateral meeting that they had with Taliban, I think Taliban would never thought that they will be the substitute for the current government, because for the previous government. Because already when we started the negotiation on the 12th of September, I had the sense that Taliban, after having the deal with Americans, think that they are going to be the replacement of the government in Kabul, and so therefore already that empowered Taliban. But what I think is that there were some talks about, towards the last days before Kabul fall, there were some talks about a possible, kind of interim setup to hand over for the current president and the administration to hand over to that interim setup. What I claim before, and I continue to do that even if we had an agreement which was 50% acceptable by all sides, was much better than what we face now in Afghanistan. So I think that was possible. If things would have been arranged properly, we are paying, unfortunately, the consequences of the wrong political decisions in Afghanistan by the former president, but also internationally by the world leaders.
Okay, but you kept calling for the Taliban to show some serious commitment to end the war and ensure peace in the country. But it was crystal clear the Taliban didn't want peace, they wanted power, all of it. The talks, really, with you and with others were just for show, weren't they? Just for show. So they played you, in effect. You seem to have believed all along that there was some international cavalry.
Yeah, this is a fighter group. This is a fighter group. What we wanted. It's true that what they know is the fighting. What we were hoping that they have learned from the history, because when they actually took control of Afghanistan in 1996 until 2001, what they were doing is only fighting, and as a result, they faced the international consequences. So for them to also be sustainably governing Afghanistan, the best forward would be inclusivity, acceptance, coexistence. They shouldn't repeat the same mistake. That's what they are doing now. The same mistakes of 1996 to 2001. Nobody is going to work with a government that is made of these fighters, people who only know how to fight. Also, from my negotiation with them, I knew that they are outdated when it comes to their government, and they don't know how to govern, but they know how to fight. Now that they took over, let's remember, they did not take Kabul militarily. Kabul actually fall because of the mistakes of the previous president. So if only the previous president didn't escape and flee the country, Kabul would have survived. And then we had that 2 weeks of time to hand over the power, hopefully. But everything went the way Taliban wanted. And now they're military extremists, or I would say the hardliners are in power. And I think those who are actually negotiating with us in Doha, the political office, also have less relevance in this situation. So I don't think this is going to be sustainable. They need to know that.
You seem to have believed all along that some kind of international cavalry would ride to your aid and in the end would help you out. But Fawzia Koofi, the fact is that America, for better or worse, was your cavalry. And for 20 years, it tried to promote change, opening educational and business opportunities, offering know-how, vast amounts of cash and equipment and infrastructure. But through all this period, the government side, your government side, which was supposed to be the good side, which the West was supporting, remained in many ways rotten to the core, didn't it? So I know you want to blame America and you want to blame the international community for the way it left, but there's a sizable responsibility that belongs to this rotten government that you had time and time again, isn't there?
And I was a critic of the administration in Kabul for the way they govern, and I continue to be, because corruption was one of the main reasons for the collapse of our security forces. When my province, Badakhshan, fall to the Taliban. First time I was in Doha negotiating, I went back home to Kabul to talk with these officials, security officials, and see what is the problem, what went wrong, why did they surrender and left everything that they had to Taliban. And they were telling me stories about, how they were not paid for months and how they did not eat for days. So in a battlefield, how do you expect people to fight when they are not paid properly? And let's remember the former president was not somebody who actually was always elected based on votes, but rather he was imposed to Afghan people through a political consensus in 2014 and in 2019. So I think it's time for the world to listen to the people of Afghanistan. Yes, you have been doing enormously generous support to Afghan people in terms of your blood and cash. We appreciate that. But I think you did it based on what you wanted. You came to when I say you, I mean the international community. You came to Afghanistan in 2001 because your own territory was at risk, not because we wanted you to come, but you came, and many people actually appreciated and celebrated your presence in Afghanistan, because for many of us it meant liberty, it meant freedom. We appreciated that, but I think mistakes started from the time that the world started intervening in every small step, including the election results, and therefore the people who actually were injected by the US and favored by them were the ones the most corrupt. And we see the current president, or the former president, he had no roots, but was he elected by people? No.
Fawzia,
in 2 elections, no. So I think a lot of people to be blamed, but the conclusion...
A lot of people are to be blamed, but help me on this one, because people in the West are wondering and wondered over the 20 years why they were supporting a government that not only was corrupt, and we'll come on to corruption in detail a bit later, but carried out endlessly a series of human rights abuses. Just take a small part of the US government report for last year, citing extrajudicial killings by security forces, reports of torture and cases of cruel, inhuman or degrading punishment by security forces, arbitrary detention by government security forces, recruitment and use of child soldiers, and sexual abuse of children, including by security force members and educational personnel. And this was supposed to be the good side that America was supporting. How do you justify that? How can you criticize the West?
But in the meantime, we had institutions.
When your government was doing that.
But in the meantime, we had institutions that were able to hold these officials that were corrupt, that were, charges of human rights violation accountable.
You didn't hold them accountable.
At least there was checks and balance. There were institutions, because these stakes...
You didn't hold them accountable. They kept on doing what they were doing.
I remember that every time these things happen, we visited prisons, we hold them accountable. But let's remember that these things happen in most of the societies that are in developing. The fact that you have institutions that could bring checks and balance and bring accountability mechanism, that is the way moving forward. Right now, you do not have any of those mechanisms. During the time that there was a parliament and I was chairing the Human Rights Committee in the parliament, I had the most difficult time dealing with some of those officials and trying to ensure that the laws are implemented. The media was another power. We had a very strong media that, hold these people accountable for what they did. There was a lot of transparency, and the fact that there are reports about these issues, reports about these human rights violations indicates that, these things were taken serious. The misdeeds of certain individuals should not be regarded as a system dysfunctionality. The system was working. The parliament was holding them accountable, but of course, there was always a culture of impunity. Unfortunately, we had to pay the price for that culture of impunity as women as well. But I think there were a system that was functioning, not to the extent that we hoped and expected. It was functioning. There were 3 pillars of the government. Judiciary was working. Some of these officials actually were put on trial, which not what we wanted. All of them were not. There were some level of protection and impunity. But I think there was a hope. There was some level of institutions functionality.
Well, that's not the way the international community looked at it. You mentioned mentioned justice. Freedom House says that corruption among the judiciary was extensive, with judges and lawyers often subject to threats and bribes from local leaders or armed groups. That's not a strong institution. Among police officers, there were high levels of corruption and complicity in organised crime, particularly near key smuggling routes. And you talked about strong institutions. None of those institutions functioned as they should have and were properly held to account, were they? Let's take elections. Fraud was a consistent feature of all the elections since 2005. This according to the US Institute of Peace. Candidates were coerced and threatened. Some were murdered during their campaigns, others before the results could be announced. Really, is that the way you see democracy having worked in your country? Even the Secretary General of NATO referred to the huge dysfunctionality of the government and its institutions in your country. Huge dysfunctionality.
I agree towards the last years, 2, 3 years, 4 years, or since 2014, when the new president, when the former president was elected, President Ghani, not elected, basically selected on a political settlement that made him the president, and his opponents, the CEU, and this power sharing started, things became worse in terms of priorities. Priorities basically were on who should be appointed where. I completely share that with you. We are on the same page on that. However, what I'm trying to say is people like us, representative and people, the nation of Afghanistan, should not be punished for what the others did wrong, for what the public should, the officials did wrong. We have done our job. The people, the institutions did what they could in terms of bringing transparency and accountability. We made some of the laws that were never repeated in our history to make such laws, and we monitored the enforcement of those laws. Some of the corrupt officials, unfortunately, were protected by the president, but this was not silence. It was brought to justice or to the public, and people trusted. Remember, yes, elections were full of problem, and in 2018, I was a victim of the corrupt electoral system. However, that being said, people still trusted the election. There was no alternative to the election. In 2014, when there was a presidential election, people's fingers were cut by Taliban for using the ink to vote. But people still voted. They didn't see any alternative. The fact that they were part of the process, taking all the risks. It was not easy for anybody, especially for those who were living in the villages, to get out of their, villages, go to the voting centers and vote. When they come back to the villages, they will have to face the consequences of Taliban oppression. So people were in the midst of bad and worse choices, unfortunately.
All
the
right.
bad was the government, the worst were the Taliban.
Oh.
Now, we didn't have a good option. The good option would have been if there was a power sharing where Taliban, as one reality, were part of it, but the other political community, including the women, were also the other major part of it.
Well, that doesn't look very likely at the moment. Fawzia Koofi, women's rights are often cited as the big win from the last few years in Afghanistan, with activists like you trying and in some areas succeeding in pushing the boundaries. But not all Afghan women have been clamoring for rights or pushing for a liberal lifestyle, education, were they? In reality, women in Afghanistan remain hugely divided, don't they? You saw that among women MPs. You talked in years past about some who were bankrolled by extreme conservative groups and spoke out for them, didn't they? Isn't it the truth that most women living outside the cities never benefited from the rights that you fought for and now have no chance to obtain them at all?
Well, this is the claim a lot of male politicians in Afghanistan raise in order to invalidate our fights for women rights, because they always say that the women who are in the cities do not represent women in the villages, and women in the villages have different claims, different priorities. In some cases, it might be true, and it's a global phenomenon, including Europe. I don't know how many women in the villages of Europe actually have the same claim and the same desire as women in the cities. So I think it's a global phenomenon. However, in Afghanistan, yes, it's true that probably women in the villages do not speak the same way that I speak, but they have the same desire as I do. If you talk to women in the villages in Kandahar, Badakhshan, Bamyan, no matter where, they want their daughters to go to school. They want their daughters to have a future. So I don't think, yes, it's a very fragmented society. There is huge discrepancy between cities' life and villages' life. But now you see that although it's risky and that the women of Afghanistan face Taliban's gun to their chest, but still, that is the empowered generation that go to the streets to protest. And we are very, very proud of what they do, including in the provinces. So it is not always the same, but the claims are the same. Women, no matter where they live in Afghanistan, they want their daughters, if not them, to have a future. They want their daughters to go to school. This is very unlike when I was a child. When I was a child, my mother did not allow, and my father, in fact, did not allow my sisters to go to school. But, you know, in the same village where I come from, a lot of men actually come to me asking for girls' schools for their girls. That is a transformational that happened in Afghanistan. And I think Taliban and other male politicians should understand and respect that transformation.
I'm wondering what you expect of Afghan women now, because you were almost scolding them when you said on August the 24th that women have to be more united than ever and guarantee they have a presence. It's not acceptable that they are sitting in the corner of their houses monitoring the situation. That's what you said to Tolo News on August the 21st. But it's easy for you to say that, isn't it? You left 6 days after that. It's easy for you to say, get out there, stop sitting in your houses. Not so easy for them.
And they listened. And they listened. They listened to what we say. So it's important to inspire people, and it's important that your message get across. It's important where you are, you make a difference. And people listen to it. And you know that they got to the streets and they didn't most of them, they didn't sit in the corners of their houses, although very risky, including last week when we had a press conference and a protest of women. You know, they actually were searched after that. They were summoned. Their family members were pressurized. So they take that enormous risk. And as I said before, I'm doing what I can internationally. Very soon, I will also join them on the streets. But I think we have to make a difference where we are, and we have to make the best use of the opportunity. So now the world needs to listen, because very soon I think Afghanistan will not be making the headlines anymore, because people in your parts of the world, they want to see people are massacred on the streets, and then they take it serious. If women are oppressed, not to go to school. If women are oppressed, to stay home. If men are even oppressed, extrajudiciary killings still, extrajudiciary punishments. That is not making headlines, because as long as, you know, there are no massacres and big explosions, then it's not making headlines. The world must realize that if we continue to act passive and do not listen to the people of Afghanistan, you are going to pay also the implications and security implications, especially consequences. And so therefore, I'm trying to do my job here. We still believe that we have to unite, and we are working virtually with each other around the world, because women of Afghanistan nowadays are spread with those who are also on the ground. Very difficult. They are leaving their houses. They are changing their locations. We don't want to put them at risk, but at the end of the day, they listened to my call when I told them to get out and ask for their rights.
Just looking at the future, what happens if the humanitarian crisis continues to get worse? What happens if it all falls apart? Do you see civil war? Would Afghans fight, or are they sick of fighting, sick of violence?
Tim, I mean, it's a heartbreaking situation in my country. Only people who actually undergo that situation will understand the pain. No words can explain the pain of a woman who has lost her husband into the army fighting against Taliban, her brother with the Taliban fighting against the army. Now she has these little kids, no job, no income, no future. Only she will understand the pain. So moving forward, I think people are fed up with the war, but I think some people are left with no options but to fight. I believe in civilian protest. I believe in civilian disobedience. I believe the people will continue to disobey what is imposed to them. But in the meantime, I think the international community should keep a line of contact with the Taliban to pressurize them to understand that if they want to really live with peace with their nation and with the world, they need to form an inclusive government, including women, ethnic groups, religious minorities, and respect the rights of people. Because let's remember that other military extremist groups are inspired by what the Taliban did, and they claim that they defeated the superpower. So a lot of inspired group will probably be in a much desire to use Afghanistan soil for their victory and for their political or even military activities.
All right.
So we need to keep this, watch the situation, especially pressurize the Taliban for them to be accountable for what's happening in Afghanistan.
Fawzia Koofi, thanks very much for your time. Thanks for being on Conflict Zone.